The Texas sun had barely climbed over the horizon when Clara Dawson was already in the saddle. The cool morning breeze carried the scent of dry grass across the prairie, but it couldn't hide the truth she saw every day. Her family's little ranch was fading. Months without enough rain had turned the once green pasture into brittle brown earth, and every creak of the old wooden barn reminded her that repairs cost money she simply didn't have. At 23, Clara had become the owner of the ranch only because there was no one else left. Her father had passed away the previous winter after a long illness, leaving behind a handful of cattle, a weathered cabin, and debts that seemed far larger than the land itself. Many people in the nearby town believed she would sell the ranch within a year. Some even placed quiet bets on how long she could last. But Clara had made a promise at her father's bedside. No matter how hard it gets, he had whispered with his final strength, don't let bitterness steal your heart. She had never forgotten those words. Every morning followed the same exhausting routine. She mended broken fences with rough hands that once belonged to a carefree girl. She carried heavy buckets of water from the old windmill. She checked every cow, making sure each animal had something to graze, even if the grass was growing thinner every week. By noon, sweat soaked through her faded blue shirt, and dust clung to her worn boots. Money was so scarce that she often skipped meals without mentioning it to anyone. A loaf of bread had to last several days. Coffee became a luxury she could no longer afford. Still, when travelers passed by asking for water, Clara never turned them away. She filled their canteens with a smile, even though every bucket meant another trip to the well. The people in town noticed. Old Mrs. Whitaker, who ran the small general store, often watched Clara carefully count a few coins before buying only flour, beans, and lamp oil. You're welcome to put the rest on credit, Mrs. Whitaker offered kindly. Clara smiled politely and shook her head. I'll pay for what I can today. Someone else might need that credit more than I do. Mrs. Whitaker sighed as Clara walked away carrying her small sack of groceries. The young woman never complained. She simply accepted whatever life placed before her and kept moving. Not everyone admired her determination. At the livestock auction, wealthy ranchers gathered beneath the shade of the large wooden pavilion, discussing cattle prices and upcoming sales. As Clara led her only healthy steer toward the pen, several men exchanged amused glances. Still trying to run that little place by yourself? One of them asked with a chuckle. You'd save yourself a lot of trouble if you just sold the land. That ranch isn't worth fighting for anymore. Clara tightened her grip on the rope but answered with quiet dignity. My father believed it was worth everything. The men laughed softly before returning to their conversations. Clara lowered her eyes for only a moment. Their words hurt, but she refused to let them see it. As she prepared to leave town, she noticed an elderly ranch hand struggling to load sacks of grain into an old wagon. Without hesitation, she tied her horse to a post and hurried over. Let me help, she said. The old man looked embarrassed. I can't pay you. I'm not asking you to. Together they lifted each heavy sack until the wagon was full. By the time Clara climbed back onto her horse, the afternoon sun was blazing overhead. You've got your father's heart, the old man called after her. She smiled, though her eyes glistened. The ride home felt longer than usual. Dark clouds had begun gathering along the western horizon, swallowing the bright blue sky. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. Texas storms could arrive without warning. Clara urged her horse into a faster trot. She needed to secure the animals before the rain arrived. By the time she reached the ranch, the first powerful gusts of wind bent the trees near the creek. Chickens scattered toward the coop while frightened cattle drifted together against the fence. Working quickly, Clara secured the barn doors and guided the horses inside. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. Rain poured down in heavy sheets. Just as she finished fastening the final gate, something unusual caught her attention. Above the sound of the storm came the desperate whinny of a horse. She froze. The cry came again, this time weaker. Clara grabbed an old lantern and pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders before stepping back into the pounding rain. Following the sound toward the narrow trail leading past her property, she spotted the outline of a horse lying awkwardly on the muddy ground. Beside it, a man struggled to rise before collapsing again. Without stopping to wonder who he was or where he had come from, Clara rushed through the rain toward the injured stranger. She had almost nothing left in this world, but if someone needed help, she would never ride away. The storm raged with such force that Clara could barely keep the lantern lit. Rain lashed against her face as she knelt beside the fallen stranger. His dark hat had been swept several feet away by the wind, revealing rain-soaked brown hair plastered across his forehead. Blood trickled from a cut near his temple, mixing with the muddy water beneath him. "Sir?" Clara called, gently touching his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" The man groaned but didn't answer. His horse struggled to stand nearby, favoring one front leg. The frightened animal snorted nervously each time thunder rolled across the prairie. Clara looked from the unconscious rider to the injured horse. She was alone. There was no neighbor close enough to hear her over the storm, and riding to town for help would take at least an hour, far too long in weather like this. She whispered a quick prayer. "Lord, help me do what's right." First, she approached the horse slowly, speaking in a calm voice. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The gelding trembled but allowed her to take hold of its reins. After a careful inspection, Clara realized the leg wasn't broken, only badly strained. She guided the exhausted animal toward the shelter of her barn, stopping often so it wouldn't fall again. Once the horse was safely inside, she returned for the stranger. He was much heavier than she expected. Using every ounce of strength she possessed, Clara slipped one of his arms across her shoulders and slowly pulled him upright. The injured man leaned heavily against her as they struggled through the rain toward the cabin. By the time they reached the porch, both of them were soaked to the bone. Inside, Clara quickly stirred the dying fire back to life. Flames slowly danced across the logs, filling the tiny cabin with warmth. She removed the stranger's soaked coat and boots, laying them near the fireplace to dry. She hesitated for a moment before cleaning the cut on his forehead with warm water and the last clean bandage she owned. "You're lucky," she murmured softly. "Another mile in that storm and no one would have found you." The man remained unconscious. Clara searched his coat for something that might identify him. She found only a leather wallet containing several folded bills, a silver pocket watch, and a simple card with his first name written neatly across it. Luke. No family name. No address. She quietly placed everything back into the coat pocket. "It isn't my place to go digging through someone else's life," she said to herself. Instead, she covered him with the thick quilt her mother had sewn years earlier. The smell of simmering bean soup soon filled the cabin. It was the last of what Clara had cooked that morning. There wasn't enough for 2 generous meals, but she wasn't about to let an injured man go hungry. Hours later, Luke slowly opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, built from rough pine boards instead of polished timber. A crackling fire glowed nearby. He tried to sit up but winced immediately. "Easy," Clara said, setting down a cup of warm water. "You took quite a fall." He blinked several times before focusing on her face. "Where am I?" "My ranch." "You carried me here?" She nodded. "You and your horse." His expression revealed genuine surprise. "You managed all that by yourself?" "I've learned to do most things by myself." Luke looked around the cabin. It was small but spotless. Every piece of furniture had clearly been repaired more than once. The curtains had been carefully patched. Even the wooden table had been sanded smooth where years of use had worn it down. Nothing suggested comfort or wealth. Everything suggested determination. You saved my life, he said quietly. Clara smiled. I simply helped someone who needed it. She handed him the bowl of soup. I'm afraid it isn't much. Luke tasted a spoonful. It tastes better than anything I've had in weeks. Clara laughed softly. Either you're very kind, or you've been eating terribly. For business trips, mostly terrible. She noticed he ate slowly, trying not to show how hungry he really was. Without saying anything, she pushed her own untouched piece of cornbread toward him. You should eat that too. What about you? I'm not very hungry. Luke studied her face for a moment. Something about her answer didn't feel true. He glanced toward the nearly empty pantry standing against the wall. Only a small sack of flour, a few jars of preserved vegetables, and one bag of beans remained. Realization slowly settled over him. She wasn't sharing because she had plenty. She was sharing because she had almost nothing. You don't have to give me your supper, he said gently. Clara smiled again, this time with quiet sincerity. My father used to say food fills the stomach, but kindness fills the soul. I suppose both matter. Luke looked at the woman sitting across from him. Her dress had been mended several times. Her hands were rough from years of hard work. The cabin itself was barely standing against the wind outside. Yet she carried herself with a dignity he rarely encountered among the wealthy ranch owners he met every day. Most people measured generosity by how much they could spare. Clara measured it by how much someone else needed. As thunder faded into the distance and the storm slowly passed, Luke found himself wondering about the remarkable young woman who had opened her home without asking a single question. For the first time in many years, he felt that he had met someone whose heart was richer than any fortune money could ever buy. Morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight, washing away every trace of the violent storm. Dew sparkled across the prairie, and birds sang from the cottonwood trees surrounding Clara Dawson's little ranch. For the first time in weeks, the air felt fresh instead of heavy with dust. Inside the cabin, Luke awoke to the smell of fresh biscuits baking in the cast-iron oven. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he heard Clara humming softly as she worked in the tiny kitchen. He carefully sat up. His head still ached from the fall, but the dizziness had almost disappeared. Looking down, he noticed that his torn shirt had been washed and neatly stitched where the fabric had ripped. Clara had repaired it while he slept. She turned and smiled when she saw him awake. Looks like you're feeling better. A lot better, thanks to you. You should still take it easy today. Luke swung his legs over the side of the bed. I've already been a burden long enough. You've been a guest, Clara corrected gently. There's a difference. Her words caught him off guard. He couldn't remember the last time someone had welcomed him without expecting anything in return. They shared a simple breakfast of biscuits, homemade blackberry jam, and fresh milk from Clara's only dairy cow. Luke noticed that she quietly gave him the larger biscuit while pretending not to notice. You always feed your guests better than yourself, he asked. Clara laughed. I suppose I do. You'll spoil people. Maybe the world could use a little more spoiling. After breakfast, Luke insisted on helping with the morning chores despite Clara's protests. The doctor in town would tell you to rest, she said. I didn't see a doctor. No, because you were unconscious. Then I suppose he can't complain. Shaking her head with an amused smile, Clara handed him a feed bucket. If you start feeling dizzy, you tell me immediately. Yes, ma'am. Together they crossed the ranch. Luke was surprised by how small the property really was. The fences leaned in several places. The barn roof sagged under years of neglect. Only a modest herd of cattle grazed across the dry pasture. Yet everything was clean. Every tool hung neatly in its place. Every animal looked healthy despite the difficult conditions. It was obvious that someone worked tirelessly to keep the ranch alive. While filling the water troughs, Luke noticed Clara stop beside an aging mare whose coat had begun turning gray. She gently stroked the horse's neck. "Morning, Belle." The mare nuzzled Clara's shoulder affectionately. "She's beautiful," Luke said. "My father raised her from a foal. You could probably sell her for good money." Clara looked almost offended. "Sell family?" Luke smiled. "I should have known you'd say that." As they continued working, an old wagon slowly rolled into the yard. Driving it was Mr. Jenkins, an elderly widower from the neighboring farm. He climbed down stiffly, carrying an empty basket. "I hate bothering you again, Miss Clara." "You never bother me," she replied warmly. "What do you need?" "My hands aren't what they used to be. My chicken coop roof started leaking during the storm. I'll come by this afternoon." The old man looked embarrassed. "I can't pay much." "You've already paid." He frowned. "When?" "Last winter you brought firewood after my chimney collapsed." Mr. Jenkins smiled. "I'd nearly forgotten." "I haven't." Luke watched the exchange quietly. After Mr. Jenkins left, another visitor arrived. This time it was a young widow named Sarah with her little daughter, Emily. Emily clutched a rag doll missing one button eye. "Miss Clara," Sarah said nervously, "I'm sorry to ask again, but Emily's been coughing all night." Clara immediately knelt beside the little girl. She placed the back of her hand against Emily's forehead. "No fever." She looked at Sarah. "I still have some honey and peppermint leaves. I'll make tea before you leave." Sarah's eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have." "How?" "You trusted me enough to ask." Within minutes Clara had prepared the herbal tea, carefully explaining how often Emily should drink it. Luke noticed there wasn't much honey left in Clara's cupboard. She gave nearly all of it away without hesitation. Once Sarah and Emily had gone, Luke couldn't stay silent any longer. "You keep giving things away." Clara shrugged. "They needed them. But what if you need them later?" She leaned against the porch railing, looking out across the wide Texas plains. "My father always believed kindness has a funny way of finding its way home. And if it doesn't?" She smiled peacefully. Then at least someone else's day was a little easier. Luke had spent years negotiating cattle contracts worth thousands of dollars. He had met politicians, bankers, wealthy ranch owners, and influential businessmen. Many of them spoke proudly about success. Very few spoke the way Clara did. Later that afternoon, while repairing a section of broken fence together, Luke finally asked the question that had been on his mind since waking. "Clara, why haven't you sold this place?" She paused, driving another nail into the weathered post. "Everyone else thinks I should." "They do." She looked toward the little cabin standing beneath the old oak tree. "My parents built that home with their own hands. Every fence post my father set tells part of our family's story. Every flower growing beside the porch was planted by my mother." She smiled softly. "If I sell this ranch because times are hard, then everything they worked for disappears." Luke rested his hammer against the fence. "You really believe it's worth fighting for?" "I believe love is always worth fighting for." Luke watched her return to work, her face glowing beneath the afternoon sun despite the hardships she carried. In that quiet moment, he realized something remarkable. Clara Dawson wasn't holding on to the ranch because it was valuable. She was holding on because it represented loyalty, family, and hope. And those were treasures no amount of money could ever replace. The following morning began before sunrise. Clara was already outside, saddling Belle while the eastern sky glowed with shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth left behind by the storm. For the first time in months, the ranch looked a little more alive. Tiny puddles reflected the morning light, and the thirsty grass had begun to lift its head. Luke stepped onto the porch, his bandaged forehead barely noticeable now. "I thought I told you to rest," Clara called with a teasing smile. "I did rest. You've been awake for 5 minutes." "Exactly. That's enough." She laughed and tossed him a pair of worn leather gloves. "Then if you're determined to ignore good advice, you can help me repair the north fence." "As you command." Together they rode across the pasture. The broken fence stretched nearly 50 yards, flattened by the previous night's storm. Several cattle had wandered into a nearby meadow but thankfully hadn't gone far. Luke quickly climbed down from his horse. "I'll replace the broken posts. You know how. I've fixed a fence or two." Clara handed him a hammer. "We'll see." For the next several hours, they worked side by side. Luke drove new posts into the ground while Clara stretched fresh wire between them. They settled into an easy rhythm, speaking only when necessary. It surprised Luke how naturally they worked together. Neither tried to take charge. Neither complained. They simply helped one another. By midday the sun had grown hot again. Clara spread an old blanket beneath the shade of a large oak tree and unpacked lunch from a small basket. "I'm afraid it's nothing fancy." Inside were biscuits, slices of smoked beef, cheese, and 2 bright red apples. Luke smiled. "If this isn't fancy, I've been living wrong." They ate quietly while watching the cattle graze nearby. After a few minutes, Luke noticed Clara staring thoughtfully toward the distant hills. "What are you thinking about?" She hesitated. "Rain. We just had plenty. One storm helps." She picked up a handful of dry soil, letting it slip slowly through her fingers. "But one storm doesn't end a drought." Luke nodded. "You worry every day." "I have to." "What happens if the rains don't return?" Clara gave a small smile that held more courage than confidence. "Then I'll find another way." "You always have another way?" "I try." Before Luke could respond, the sound of wagon wheels echoed across the prairie. A young boy rode toward them as fast as his mule could manage. He couldn't have been older than 12. His face was pale with panic. "Miss Clara." She stood immediately. "Tommy? What's wrong?" "It's Mama." He struggled to catch his breath. "She fell while carrying water, and she won't wake up." Without asking another question, Clara gathered the medical supplies she kept in her saddlebag. "Take me there." Luke stood as well. "I'm coming." The boy's family lived nearly 2 miles away in a tiny cabin beside the creek. When they arrived, Tommy's mother lay unconscious on the floor while 2 frightened younger children cried nearby. Clara knelt beside the woman. She checked her breathing, then gently felt her pulse. "She's alive." The children looked at her hopefully. "Will she be all right?" "I think so." She carefully examined a bruise on the woman's head. She likely struck the table when she fell. Luke fetched cool water while Clara cleaned the wound. After several anxious minutes, the woman slowly opened her eyes. Tommy burst into tears of relief. "Mama." She smiled weakly. "I'm all right." Clara helped her sit up slowly. "You need rest for at least a day." The woman looked around the cabin with worry. "I can't." "The children." "The children will manage." Luke spoke before realizing it. "I'll chop your firewood." Everyone turned to look at him. Tommy grinned. "Really?" Luke smiled. "Really?" For the next 2 hours, he worked outside splitting logs while Clara prepared soup, swept the cabin, and made sure the family had enough clean water and food for several days. When they finally rode home that evening, the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon. Luke broke the comfortable silence. "You do this often?" "What?" "Helping people." Clara looked genuinely puzzled. If they need help. But they can't repay you. They don't have to. Luke slowed his horse. You spend time, food, medicine, everything you have. She smiled gently. My father used to tell me something. What was that? He said wealth isn't measured by what stays in your hands. Luke waited. It's measured by what leaves them to bless someone else. The word settled deeply into his heart. For years he had measured success by acres of land, healthy cattle, profitable investments, and growing bank accounts. Yet the happiest person he had met in years owned almost nothing. As they approached the ranch, they noticed a rider waiting near the front gate. He wore an expensive black coat and polished boots that looked strangely out of place in the dusty countryside. The moment he spotted Clara, a smug smile crossed his face. Miss Dawson, the man called. I've been looking for you. Clara's warm expression faded. Luke noticed the sudden tension in her shoulders. Who is he? He asked quietly. She kept her eyes fixed on the waiting rider. Someone who wants this ranch. And? She took a slow breath. He doesn't take no very well. The stranger tipped his hat politely, but there was nothing friendly about the look in his eyes. Luke sensed immediately that the peaceful days on Clara's ranch were about to become far more complicated. The rider waited patiently beside the front gate, his tall black horse standing perfectly still beneath him. Even from a distance, Luke could see the man's expensive leather boots, silver belt buckle, and spotless black hat. Nothing about him suggested a hard-working rancher. Everything about him spoke of wealth and confidence. Clara slowly guided Belle toward the gate, her cheerful expression gone. Good evening, Mr. Whitmore, she said politely. The man removed his hat with practiced charm. Miss Dawson. You look well. I've been busy. I can see that. His eyes briefly shifted toward Luke before returning to Clara. And who might this be? A traveler whose horse was injured during the storm, Clara answered. He's staying until he's well enough to continue. Whitmore nodded, though his sharp gaze lingered on Luke longer than necessary. My name is Luke, he said simply. The man offered a brief handshake. Edward Whitmore. Luke noticed the grip was firm, almost competitive. I hope Miss Dawson has made you comfortable. She saved my life. Whitmore forced a smile. Yes. Clara has always had a habit of helping people. The compliment sounded sincere, but something beneath his tone felt cold. Clara dismounted. What brings you here? Whitmore reached into his coat and removed a folded envelope. I've come with another offer. I already gave you my answer. I was hoping you'd reconsider. He handed her the envelope. Clara didn't open it. I told you before, I'm not selling. Whitmore sighed dramatically. You're holding on to a dream that cannot survive. My family's ranch isn't a dream. It's a business. He glanced across the dry pasture. Your fences need replacing. He pointed toward the weathered barn. Your roof leaks. Then toward the cattle. You've lost nearly half your herd over the past 2 years. Every word struck with uncomfortable accuracy. Luke quietly observed without interrupting. Whitmore continued. The bank won't wait forever. I know. So why make this harder on yourself? Clara looked him directly in the eyes. Because this land isn't just dirt. It can be if the bank takes it. For several long seconds neither spoke. Finally Whitmore smiled again. I've increased my offer. He tapped the unopened envelope. It's more than anyone else would pay. Clara slowly handed it back. My answer hasn't changed. Whitmore's pleasant expression disappeared. Pride won't save this ranch. No. She stood straighter. But neither will giving away everything my parents built. The rancher slipped the envelope back into his pocket. You've always been stubborn. My father called it faithful. Whitmore let out a quiet laugh. I suppose we'll see which one history remembers. Without another word, he climbed back into the saddle. As he rode away, he paused long enough to glance over his shoulder. You have 30 days before the bank reviews your loan. Then he disappeared down the dusty road. Silence settled over the ranch. Luke turned toward Clara. You never mentioned the bank. There wasn't much to mention. There is now. She sighed softly. My father borrowed money after several bad seasons. How much? I'd rather not say. You don't trust me? She smiled gently. It isn't that. Then what? I don't want anyone feeling sorry for me. Luke looked around the property once more. The worn fences. The aging barn. The hard-working young woman standing proudly in the middle of it all. He realized she had been carrying this burden completely alone. Later that evening, after caring for the animals, Clara prepared supper. The meal was simple: vegetable stew, fresh bread, and sweet tea. Luke noticed she seemed quieter than usual. You've been thinking about Whitmore. She stirred the stew slowly. I've been thinking about the future. You really believe you can save the ranch? I have to believe it. What if believing isn't enough? She stopped stirring for a moment. My father used to tell me something whenever things looked impossible. What was that? Courage isn't believing you'll win. Luke waited. It's refusing to quit before the fight is over. He smiled. Your father sounds like a wise man. He wasn't educated. Neither are many wise people. They carried their bowls onto the front porch, where the evening sky glowed with brilliant shades of orange and purple. For a while they simply watched the sunset. Finally Luke asked the question he had been wondering about since arriving. Clara, why do you keep helping everyone else when your own life is so difficult? She thought for a long moment before answering. Because I know what it's like to need help. You've asked for very little yourself. That doesn't mean I don't understand loneliness. She looked toward the neighboring ranches scattered across the distant hills. When my father became sick, many people brought food. Others repaired fences. Some sat with him while I worked. She smiled softly. I never forgot that. So now you're repaying them? I'm passing it on. Luke lowered his eyes. During his years of success, he had donated money to charities, sponsored livestock competitions, and funded improvements in several towns. People often praised him for his generosity. Yet listening to Clara, he realized there was a difference between writing a check and giving part of yourself. She gave her time. Her strength. Her compassion. Even when she had almost nothing left. As darkness settled across the prairie, Luke quietly made a decision. He would not leave this ranch until Clara Dawson's future was secure. She didn't know who he truly was. She didn't know the influence he possessed. And she certainly didn't know that Edward Whitmore had just made a powerful enemy. Watching Clara smile despite the uncertainty ahead, Luke silently promised himself one thing. No matter what it cost, he would help protect the woman whose heart was richer than all the fortunes in Texas. The next week passed in a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Each morning, Clara and Luke rose before dawn, sharing coffee made from roasted chicory instead of expensive beans. They repaired fences, checked cattle, and worked the small vegetable garden beside the cabin. Though the ranch still faced uncertainty, laughter had quietly returned to a place that had known only worry for months. For Clara, Luke's company had become a blessing she never expected. For Luke, every passing day made it harder to leave. Yet he still kept one important secret. He never mentioned that he was the owner of McCall Ranch, the largest cattle operation for nearly 100 miles. He wanted Clara to know him simply as Luke. One afternoon, while repairing the roof of the old barn, Luke noticed a cloud of dust rising from the road. 3 riders approached at a fast pace. The moment they reached the ranch, the lead rider jumped from his horse. "Mr. McCall." Luke looked down from the roof. It was Ben Carter, the foreman of his ranch. Behind him stood 2 more ranch hands. All 3 looked relieved. "There you are." Luke climbed down the ladder. "What happened?" "We've been searching for you since the storm. I figured someone would." Ben lowered his voice. "The entire ranch thinks you're missing." "I'm fine. Your horse came home alone." Luke smiled. "I can explain." Ben finally noticed Clara standing nearby. His eyes widened slightly. "So, this is the lady who rescued you?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Ben immediately removed his hat. "Ma'am, you have no idea what you've done." Clara frowned politely. "I only helped someone who needed it." "No, ma'am." Ben smiled warmly. "You saved the owner of McCall Ranch." The words hung in the air. Clara stared at Luke in complete silence. "The owner?" Luke slowly met her eyes. "Clara. You own McCall Ranch?" He nodded once. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." She took a small step backward. "So all this time, I wanted you to know me, not my money." She searched his face, trying to decide whether to feel hurt or grateful. "You should have trusted me with the truth." "I know. I treated you like an ordinary traveler." "That's exactly what I hoped you would do." Ben looked from one to the other, sensing the tension. "I'll check on the horses," he said quickly, leading the other men toward the barn. They disappeared, leaving Luke and Clara alone. The afternoon breeze gently stirred the tall grass. Finally Clara spoke. "Were you ever going to tell me?" "Yes." "When?" "When I knew you wouldn't think every kind word I spoke was because I felt sorry for you." She folded her arms. "And do you?" "What?" "Feel sorry for me?" Luke answered without hesitation. "Never." "Then why stay?" He stepped closer. "Because every day I spent here reminded me what kind of person I wanted to become." Clara looked away. "You own more land than I could ever dream of." "I do." "You have more money than this town has probably seen." "That's true." "And I'm just." She glanced toward the weathered cabin, the patched barn, and the worn fences. A poor cowgirl trying to hold on to memories. Luke shook his head. "No. You don't understand. My clothes are patched. So are mine after you repaired them. My ranch is falling apart. I've seen stronger ranches owned by weaker people. I have debts. I have responsibilities." She sighed, frustration filling her voice. "Luke." Her eyes shimmered with tears she had fought to hide for weeks. "I have nothing to offer you." The words came out almost as a whisper. Nothing but silence followed. Luke reached into his pocket and removed the silver pocket watch Clara had carefully placed back into his coat the night she rescued him. "You remember this?" She nodded. "You never opened the wallet. It wasn't mine. You never asked who I was. I didn't need to. You shared your last meal with me. You were hungry. You repaired my clothes. They were torn. You cared for my horse. He was hurt." Luke smiled with quiet admiration. "Every answer you give proves exactly what I've been trying to tell you." She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He gently took her work-worn hands into his own. "Clara Dawson." His voice was steady and sincere. "You think all you own is an old ranch, patched clothes, and unpaid debts." She lowered her eyes. "But when I look at you..." He smiled warmly. "I see courage that doesn't quit. I see kindness that asks for nothing in return. I see honesty that can't be bought. And I see the kindest heart in Texas." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. No one had ever described her that way. Not because of what she owned. Not because of what she accomplished. Simply because of who she was. At that moment, Ben returned from the barn carrying a leather satchel. "Mr. McCall," he called. "The bank manager is meeting Mr. Whitmore tomorrow morning." Luke's expression changed. "What for?" "We overheard some talk in town." Ben's smile faded. "It sounds like Whitmore intends to buy Miss Dawson's debt before the payment deadline." Clara's heart sank. "If he owns the debt, he could force the sale of this ranch," Ben finished quietly. Luke's jaw tightened. The pieces suddenly fit together. Whitmore had never been interested in making a fair offer. He had been waiting patiently for Clara to fail. Luke looked toward the distant road where Whitmore had disappeared days earlier. His voice became calm, but determined. "He thinks he's already won." Ben nodded. "What do we do?" Luke glanced at Clara, who stood silently beside him. "We fight." Clara looked at him in surprise. "You don't owe me this." Luke smiled gently. "Maybe not." He squeezed her hand once more. "But some things are worth defending." As the evening sun settled over the Texas prairie, the battle for Clara's ranch, and the future they had barely begun to imagine together, was only just beginning.